So the first question is did Jesus take upon himself fallen human flesh or unfallen human flesh? And this might seem like a very strange question for those who aren't aware of some of the debates that have happened recently. It not really recently, more in the past 100 years, but in theology, that's recent, right? Relatively. So let me kind of give an overview of what this debate is actually all about. So the idea of Christ taking upon himself a fallen flesh is something that's been emphasized by Thomas Torrance, a student of Karl Barth. And Karl Barth spoke about this as well, but Torrance seems to be the one who's emphasized it the most and has popularized the idea. And so he brought that whole discussion of the nature of Christ's flesh into prominence. And this has resulted in a bunch of different writings on the topic from various different perspectives. So there was a reformed book written against Torrance's view. I think it was released a couple years ago. Thomas Weinandy, who's a Roman Catholic, has supported Torrance's view. So this is something that has crossed denominational boundaries very much. And so we have people from the Lutheran, Reformed, Roman Catholic, and even Eastern Orthodox tradition delving into these things. There was an Eastern Orthodox book written against Torrance's view. And there are other Eastern Orthodox individuals that have supported Torrance's view as that of the Eastern Fathers, because Torrance argues that his view is the view of primarily the Eastern Fathers. So this is a very, very much a tradition. It's not bound to one particular tradition. This debate actually extends far beyond that, which is kind of rare in some theological debates, because we do tend to debate within our own confessions of faith or our own traditions. But this is something that's gone far beyond that. So I think it's an important thing to address and look at. This is something I'm actually working through right now myself. I've been doing a lot of reading on it and trying to figure out exactly what my perspective is. Because I'm discussing this in a book I'm writing right now, I'm working on the sequel to Christification. So it's a book on union with Christ, and it's going to be a lot more depth than that book was, delving into union with Christ. So part of that book, what I'm arguing in this section that I'm currently writing is I'm arguing that the hypostatic union becomes the kind of objective, paradigmatic basis for our union with Christ. Or our union with God. So we have to start any talk of union with Christ in any sense has to start with the union of God and man in the person of Christ. And so that serves as the redemptive, historical, objective basis for anything that happens individually to us. So in light of that, I'm trying to kind of tease out some things about the incarnation and exactly what it means for us. So part of that is I'm trying to say that the incarnation has redemptive value, not just in that it is a kind of prerequisite for the cross. And I think a lot of modern Western theology does that, is that sees the only value of the incarnation as this is just something that Jesus had to do so that he could do the real work of salvation, which was his death on the cross. And if you look at the fathers, looking at someone like starting at Irenaeus, and even Justin Martyr a little bit as well, you see that the incarnation and the life of Christ is significant as well. They don't start discussions of redemption just at his death or Christ's resurrection. It really starts at the incarnation itself. So the redemption that Christ wrought is a whole. And so we take each piece of it, and every piece of that has a different aspect or different benefit of salvation that is brought to us. So it's not just the death and resurrection of Jesus. I mean, Christ didn't become incarnate at the age of 33, die on a cross, raise from the dead, and then leave. He came and lived a whole life. So what was the value in that? And I think there's a lot of value in that, and that was necessary for our redemption. And so I'm starting from that perspective. And if you look at someone like Johann Gerhard, he's very much influenced by the Eastern Fathers, and he sees a lot of redemptive significance in the incarnation itself. So does Chemnitz, by the way. But Gerhard, especially in some of his devotionals texts that are so excellent, he really does draw on that a lot. So it's as much as we want to be cross-focused, and it's a right perspective to have, because Paul says things like, I preach nothing but Christ crucified. We can't do that to the exclusion of these other aspects of redemption, and the incarnation is one of those. So that serves as kind of the basis there for what I'm talking about in that particular chapter that I'm currently writing. So With that being said, the question that comes up, if the incarnation is somehow redemptive, is a significant aspect of redemption and is redemptive in some sense, what does that mean for the actual flesh that Christ takes upon himself? And this debate starts with a guy named Edward Irving, who's a Scottish minister. And this debate happened first in the Scottish church in the 19th century. And so Torrance is influenced by that. But there's a debate. Irving starts saying that Jesus took upon himself not just human flesh, but sinful flesh. And his ideas were kind of weird too. He believed that Jesus had even kind of sinful inclinations, but overcame them. And this gets into a discussion of concupiscence and the question of, is concupiscence a sin, or the desire for sin, is that itself sinful? And Luther always said yes. And so if that's the case, then Jesus couldn't have had concupiscence, or that would have meant Jesus was sinful, and therefore he was an imperfect substitute. So I don't think we can go that route, but Irving kind of goes in a more extreme direction. But after that, people like Barth and Torrance do speak about this in kind of a different, more modified way. So the way that Torrance argues, the way that he frames it, is Jesus takes upon himself a fallen human flesh. In other words, the flesh that Jesus takes upon himself, and by flesh I don't just mean physical body, we mean the entirety of the human nature. Just to be clear, we're not Apollinarians here or something. So Jesus takes upon himself a fallen human nature, not just a human nature in general. And so what do we mean by that? Because that can be confusing, because it can sound like Jesus took upon himself a sinful nature and Jesus sinned like the rest of us, but just happened to overcome his sin. And that's clearly not the case. The scripture is very clear that Jesus did not sin. If you look at the book of Hebrews, the value of his priestly work and his sacrifice are largely within his sinlessness. And so if we have no sinless substitute, we have no substitute at all that can actually save us. So if you come to that point of saying that Jesus sinned, you've fallen into heresy. So someone like Steve Paulson takes some of Luther's statements and about Jesus becoming sin for us, and says Jesus committed his own personal sin on the cross as he cried out about his God-forsakenness. And he does that in his book, Lutheran Theology. He's never recanted that, at least in writing, that he has said that. And I'm currently reading his last book, and I know he's got another one coming out really soon. So I haven't seen him address it. I haven't seen him say that in other places. So I don't know if that's just a slip of the pen and he meant to say something else, but that is what comes across. So that I would say is heresy. Obviously, I think that's kind of obvious. I mean, that's one of the basic teachings of the Christian faith. Jesus was sinless. According to Hebrews, he's sinless. If he sins, he's not a perfect sacrifice substitute. We're all lost. So pretty important. So Torrance isn't trying to say that Jesus personally sinned, but what he's trying to say is Jesus takes upon himself a human nature, not in just its Adamic state, but in its fallen state. So Jesus is a second Adam, but at the same time, he's not Adam in the sense that he's not created in righteousness in the same sense that Adam is. So Adam is created upright, righteous, and he has the possibility of falling into sin, which he does, of course. But Adam was eating of the tree of life. There was no mortality in Adam. And so Jesus, throughout his life, has various aspects of our predicament. In other words, Jesus, when he becomes a human, comes into a fallen world and takes upon himself the entire fallen human predicament. And so Jesus suffers sickness and injury, and ultimately Jesus can die. He deals with pains of hunger and thirst and these kinds of things. So things that Adam, and not that Adam wouldn't have been hungry, because he still needed to eat, and that was just part of his reliance on God for his sustaining. Recognition of Adam that he cannot sustain himself or his own life. He needs to rely on things outside of himself, extranos, in order for his life to be sustained, just as we all do. None of us are self-sufficient. And so that's probably true. But in terms of like the pains of hunger, Or Jesus experiences the sorrow of a fallen world as he weeps at the death of Lazarus. So Jesus takes upon himself more than just the state of Adam. And so I think a lot of this goes to, there are a couple places in Scripture that I think we can look at that talk about this. Romans 8 talks about how Jesus took upon himself, this is Romans 8:3, the likeness of sinful flesh. And this phrase is one that is debated. That's kind of at the heart of a lot of these debates. What does it mean that he took upon himself the likeness of sinful flesh? And so part of the argument that Torrance makes is he does use that phrase sarx instead of soma. Soma just means body, but it's more of a neutral term than sarx is, which is the term translated as flesh. And often sarx has this kind of negative connotation of the sinful state of humanity. And so the fact that Jesus is often referred to as taking flesh in the New Testament rather than just soma, he says points to there's something about Jesus taking a flesh that he's taking upon something of our fallen state. Not in the sense that he sins, but in the sense that he's experiencing all of those effects of sin. And so what Torrance says is that Jesus is basically, he's sanctified, he's set apart in the womb. So that the Spirit is there sanctifying him in the womb. So he takes the flesh of Mary, a sinner, and part of the argument that Torrance makes is this idea departs as soon as you start talking about the Immaculate Conception, because then it doesn't really work. So he takes the flesh of a regular sinful person, but that flesh is sanctified by the Holy Spirit and the power of the Holy Spirit. So it is flesh from a sinner, in that sense, sinful flesh, but that flesh is sanctified in some sense or set apart. But then at Jesus' birth, we do then have this progressive kind of sanctifying of Christ in a sense, in that, he learns obedience. Scripture uses that language. He learns obedience. So there is even though he's set apart in the womb and sinless, and original sin is taken away, there's still a growth that is occurring in the life of Christ. And so we could even say there's a progressive sanctification in a sense. It depends on how you're using that term, but he's continually setting himself apart as holy and as our representative. Not in the sense of coming from sin to righteousness, because there's no sin in Jesus, so it's different. But he does use language like, I sanctify myself. And the idea is that Jesus is sanctified for us. And he is doing all of this for us. So everything in his life is done for us. So the language that Torrance uses is Jesus is trying to bend back our sinful will throughout his life. So it's like he has all of the fallenness of humanity in a sense, but he has sanctified it. And so he is think about Augustine's language of incurvatus se. We are curved in on ourselves by nature because of original sin. We're looking at our own wants, our own needs, our own desires. We're not looking to anybody else. And Jesus is constantly pushing himself out and only looking for others. But in doing that, he's doing something for humanity as a whole. So he's taking the human race who has been corrupted and messed up, and now he's living that life righteously. And to do that, he has to take upon himself not just a sinful nature, or not just a nature in the state of Adam, but a fallen nature in some sense. And I keep saying that in some sense because this does have to be qualified, and I'm not sure that we can give a complete picture of exactly what that means. So as you can probably tell, I do think that Torrance is onto something here. I think we have to be very careful on how we speak about it, but I don't think that he is wrong per se in this idea. I think that there is something redemptive about the incarnation, that Jesus pretty clearly takes upon himself the state not just of Adam in the garden, but there's something uniting him to our state. And you see this language in Luther, or this kind of realist language of Jesus being the greatest sinner, taking sin upon himself in this real way, not of actually sinning, but becoming one with sinners in this intimate sense. He shares the same flesh and substance, and he's part of that. Torrance uses the term the sarkic age or sarkic condition, the fleshly age and condition that comes as a result of the fall. And I think we see that just in the language that Jesus is tempted in every way just as we are. So what does that mean? I don't think we can say that Adam was tempted in every way just as we are. Now, Adam had temptation because he gave into it, but does Adam really have the fullness of all of these temptations coming at us, at him like we have? I don't think so. So Jesus had, in a sense, I think, a greater temptation than Adam had because he's come into this fallen state of humanity. And he's come into the fallen state to redeem that fallen state. So this comes from what's called the non-assumptus principle from Gregory Nazianzen, who says, he's writing about the Apollinarians, who basically said that Jesus had a divine mind, not a human mind. And he says that can't be true. And he gives his reason. He says, what has not been assumed cannot be redeemed, or the unassumed is the unhealed, as it's summarized as often. So this is the idea that Jesus has to assume the entirety of the human nature in order to then take that and heal it. So everything that Jesus takes upon himself, he heals. So if there is then no fallenness in the human nature, in a sense, then Jesus can't heal that. So Jesus has to come into the fallen condition in order to redeem that. And this is like what Irenaeus talks about with recapitulation, that he's coming into and living all of the stages of human life. This is why he comes as an infant, childhood, and then adulthood, and he's righting what's been wrong. So he's coming into that fallen state and assuming all that entails, but fixing it or turning it around. And Irenaeus uses the language of, he more speaks in language that's more common in Eastern Orthodoxy, I think, not so much in forensic terms, but more in, not that that's necessary. I mean, it's maybe there a little bit, but not much. I think the preferred way of speaking about salvation for Irenaeus, I mean, he talks about Adam as kind of living in childhood, and there's this progression toward maturity that's expected, but instead he sins, and now he's kind of pushed in this direction. So Adam has brought humanity into this fallen direction. We're all going this way. Jesus has come, and now he's grabbing us and pulling us this way into the maturity that we were called to in the first place. And he's doing that through redeeming the human nature. So that starts with Irenaeus. Now Torrance so grabs onto these ideas. He makes the argument that the Western Church is wrong, and the Eastern Church has always held to these ideas. And he talks about Leo, Pope Leo, who helped formulate the definition of the Council of Chalcedon. He says that he basically had the idea of an unfallen flesh, and that then was that idea of the unfallen flesh then was basically adopted by the entire Western Church, and he blames everything on this. He says everything that's bad in the West came from this. And Torrance is kind of opposed in some ways to forensic categories, and I obviously am not. I'm very big on forensic categories. Forensic justification, I think, is very clear in Scripture, and I think it's really important. But I'm a Lutheran, so that's, of course, I believe that. I shouldn't say of course, because there are some that are against that, I guess. But so he uses some of the same kind of polemics, I think, that a lot of Eastern Orthodox writers do. And he has a large affinity for Eastern Orthodoxy. So there are a lot of Eastern Orthodox scholars of Torrance. And I think, for good reason. There's a lot of good in Torrance. There's a lot that I don't agree with in Torrance as well, but I think there is a lot of good there. So he has this idea of this kind of Western heresy, that this assumption of an unfallen humanity comes in. But there's been more research and work done on that, and I think it's pretty clear that though Leo can be read that way, there's a lot more nuance and balance to what Leo said than just that. And I think if you look at someone like Thomas Whitehandy, who is a Roman Catholic, very much in the Western tradition, he pretty clearly demonstrates this divide between East and West on this is not as strong as Torrance purports that it is. It is true that the language of fallenness in humanity is found more so in the Eastern Fathers. You can find it in people like Ambrose, though, who's a very significant Western Father. But you can find similar ideas. It's the language is a little different. The way it's formulated in the East is different. But they're not so opposed to each other as is often sad. And that's, I mean, a lot of what I've been saying in all of my writings too, is this idea that we have to pick between either salvation is forensic or participatory, like East forensic, West participation. Wait, I said that backwards. You get the point. So yeah, but the idea that like we have these two opposing schemes is just wrong. There's Scripture uses both. The church fathers use both. So there's no reason why we need to have one and not the other. Let's have both, like that meme. Why not both? You know. So this, yeah, for what it's worth, this is my answer on this fallenness of Jesus' human nature. I think that it is true that Jesus assumes a fallen human nature. In a sense, we just have to define what that is, and it can fall into heresy if you explain it wrongly. So it's kind of a dangerous place to be, in a sense, to talk about it in that way. So I wouldn't say that without nuance and explanation. You know, I wouldn't, like, in a sermon just say, oh, Jesus took upon himself, or Jesus had a sinful human nature or something, because people be like, what? Did Jesus sin? You know, so you have to, so there's a way in which to use this language that has to be explained so people understand what you're saying, because you don't want to do a Paulson and say Jesus committed his own personal sin. But you have to speak about the incarnation in a way that he's really coming into a fallen condition in order to redeem that fallen condition. And I think that's an essential part of the Christian faith. So I definitely don't think it's as overarching of a concern as Torrance does. He kind of formulates his whole theology in a way around this idea, which I'm not. But at the same time, every theologian who discovers something really important always kind of reformulates everything around that idea. That's like always our tendency, because we're really excited and like, I found a new thing. I found something. I discovered something in the fathers that people haven't been talking about. So that's the only thing that matters, and everything else is subsumed under that. Everybody has a tendency to do that. So I get it. But this does get into Torrance's view of things like biblical inspiration and errors in the Bible. As he kind of connects to this, he views that he says that there are errors in Scripture, and that's part of like the fallenness that God takes upon himself. So there's this kind of way of using this in a way that I certainly would not agree with. So that's something to be aware of. But if you do want to read on it, by the way, Torrance is really accessible. So I've got his book right here since I've been reading it. This is his work on the Incarnation. I think it's really helpful. I definitely recommend reading it. I don't agree with everything in this book, but if you do want to get kind of a taste of Torrance and where he's at on this, I would definitely recommend this book. This is a series of lectures. It's super accessible. This is not really tough to read through. This is not like reading Barth, where it's completely incomprehensible and he seems to contradict himself on one page and then the next. So if you're going to read anybody coming out of neo-orthodoxy, read Torrance. I mean, Barth's just a waste of time. I'm sorry. I don't deny that Barth is brilliant. He is. But if you read Barth scholars, nobody agrees on anything that the guy says, because he's a bundle of contradictions in so many ways. And he's so uncareful with how he says things. I mean, I've read 6 volumes of the Church Dogmatics, and those things are dense. And to be honest, I read them, and I don't know that I knew any more about what Barth believed after reading them than I did before. And then I started reading Hunsinger and McCormick and all of these interpreters of Barth, and I have no idea what Barth taught in a lot of ways. Like, I have no idea, and I don't know that anybody really does. I don't know that Barth himself knew what he was saying half the time. Anyway, that's probably kind of inflammatory, but it is what it is. So there's my long answer to that complicated question.